The main character has always been the one person that no one could ever surpass. Not in beauty, not in wealth, not even in status. And of course, Marsidia was the busiest person in the empire and attracted the most attention. And yet she was never a woman who could fall asleep anywhere. But for some reason, she had been feeling very strange lately. Eventually, she did fall asleep, and the moment of her awakening came. She did not realize where she was, and also, while her consciousness was coming to her, she did not realize when and where she had managed to fall asleep, and also did not realize why her body seemed quite heavy to her. But suddenly, there came the voice of the maids, who informed her that Lady Marsidia was waking up, and they should immediately hold her arms and legs, as they were only half ready. When the protagonist opened her eyes, she couldn't understand what their conversation was about, and couldn't realize what they were talking about and why it was so noisy. But eventually, when she opened her eyes, she saw the maids in front of her doing her makeup, combing her hair, and giving her manicures. The protagonist behaved calmly and tried to realize what was happening. She ordered herself to calm down and began to recall the last memory she had before she fell into sleep, and realized that the last thing she had done was drink tea, so she assumed that in all likelihood something had been spiked in it. Then she remembered that the tea had been brought to her by a merchant she had been working with for a long time. She resented the fact that the girl had been drugged, even though she was the daughter of the most powerful family in the empire, the Sasha family. And was all this really just to kidnap her? But after she realized that she was surrounded by maids whom she had personally hired, so she turned to one of them and asked why she was applying her makeup so strangely and drawing the wings of her nose like that, because she would look too fragile that way. But the girl only exhaled calmly and explained that it was necessary, after which the other maids brought her to the mirror. When the protagonist looked at herself, she realized that she looked good, but thought that she and the outfit and makeup were not at all to her taste. But it is quite normal for her to come to the castle in such a way. Then she realized her hand to take a couple of pictures, but found that she didn't have her communicator on her hand. So she turned to the maids and asked where her magical communicator was. But they immediately started walking away, pretending they hadn't heard her question. The main character was very unhappy, so she went to one of them directly and asked where they had put her magical communicators and what they were up to. And after that, she said that she absolutely did not like this makeup because it made her look like a doll, and asked what they had done with her clothes and why she looked so strange. The maid was just trying to convince the girl that she looked really beautiful. But the one who looked displeased informed herself that even if she looked beautiful, it didn't mean it was her taste, for she was wearing a white dress with lace, and it looked very much like a wedding dress her mother might have picked out. But suddenly it hit her, and she opened her eyes wide and looked at the servants around her. They were completely unresponsive. It was as if they were trying to avoid her gaze. But suddenly, one of them spoke up and awkwardly confirmed the girl's hunch that she was getting ready to get married. She was literally shocked. She was shaking with anger. The main character did not understand how her relatives dared to slip her such a trap. After all, she worked hard all her life and went very far. Then she rose abruptly from her seat. The maids explained in a panic that she must not move now, otherwise she might wrinkle or fall again. And besides, she was not wearing shoes. But the protagonist didn't care at all, so she lifted up the hem of her dress and walked away, thinking that now she wasn't walking on a wooden floor, but just a carpet, so she'd be all right even if she fell. But she was still very worried about the slight jiggling after the medicine she had been given, and afterward began to ponder the fact that she had guessed more than once that her parents would think of something to marry her off, and then resolutely opened the curtains to see where she was. But to her horror, she found that she was facing an ocean from which she could not escape. She turned excitedly to the maid, and was evidently displeased, so she asked her what was going on and inquired who the fool was whom she was marrying, and asked if he was on this ship. But the racing lady calmly explained that Miss Marsidia should not speak in such a way about her fiancé and should be more careful in her language. But she was not pleased and asked why she should behave in such a way, for her fiancé had not even a drop of common sense. For if she had, he would never have married her, for she was Marsidia Sasha, the most famous girl in the empire and the only daughter of the Sasha family. Her beauty amazed and attracted the eyes of everyone, but it wasn't her origin that made her famous. It was her attitude towards other people. She remembered her conversation with a young man. She looked him over unhappily and told him that if his gun in his pants wasn't big enough, then he should have at least learned some techniques. He wasn't very good at either, so she wasn't going to go out with him. After what happened back at her house, the protagonist sat in her magic tablet and reflected on the fact that she had only told the guy about it because he acted as if he had done something great, although they had just slept together once. And then she thought that after that incident, the guy had run away abroad because he was called a man who is bad at everything. As a result, all the men who could not become the protagonist's mate were looking for more compliant girls. Any man's pride will be ruined forever as soon as they try to approach Marcedia. But she wasn't upset at all, because that's what she originally wanted to be. The protagonist was insanely disgusted to even look down the ugly street of the men who wanted to be with her. Eventually, she just turned around and started running away from the maids and yelled to them that it would be obvious that her fiancé was an unbelievable idiot who would say that he was not like all her previous men. Or he would just be a pig who thought that his money could decide absolutely everything. The maids were excited, and so they asked where the girl was going to run off to, but she didn't care at all, so she approached the door and wanted to head towards the one who was her fiancé. She didn't understand how some man dared to touch Marcedia Sasha herself and promised that she would make him want to marry her forever. And the first thing she did was scream the bastard who wanted to marry her. To her great surprise, a man appeared who was clearly insanely displeased and looking at her with complete attention. The protagonist raised her worried gaze to him and didn't understand what this guy was doing here. But the man gave her a cold stare and asked what she meant. Then I realized that the protagonist was now Admiral Demetrius Kypros of the Navy. The man grudgingly interjected, "Did she really just call him a bastard?" At this time, the protagonist remembered that Demetrius is a famous war hero in the Empire, and he got the title of Admiral because he never lost a battle. And people say that if it wasn't for this man, the war on the borders would never have ended. And he's not married. So the protagonist looked at him with a very careful and dissatisfied look, and realized that apparently this was the man who would become her husband. So she smiled slyly and wondered what a man like the Admiral was doing on this ship. The protagonist, Marcedia Sasha, was the most beautiful woman in the Empire, and Demetrius Cypros was the greatest military hero in the Empire. But behind their backs, people called them absolutely different. The protagonist was nicknamed the main bitch of the Empire, and the man in front of her was called the Empire's biggest asshole. The girl looked at him carefully and admitted to herself that she absolutely did not understand who had come up with such an idea for their marriage. But even the thought of it was so unbelievable that one could go crazy. But the next moment, Demetrius drew his sword from its sheath and pointed it at the neck of the protagonist. Your movements are very sharp, but still he did not immediately cut off her head. Suddenly interrupting them sharply came the voice of the excited maids, who ran up and inquired of Marcedia, "What has happened?" Demetrius paid absolutely no attention to it, so he gave the main character a serious look and said that all this time he had been wondering who had invited him in such an unbelievable way, and then asked the girl if he could go back if he killed her. But she calmly informed him that he should back off, and afterward added that she was madly sorry to report it, but that she, too, was a victim of circumstance. Then the protagonist looked behind his back and found that there was a hatch that was quite high above the ocean level, so she realized that they were on the highest deck. And then she looked closely at the guy in front of her, and she had absolutely no idea what was wrong with him. She was clearly aware that he certainly didn't look like a man who really wanted to marry her, but still, she wasn't displeased with his behavior. So glaring at him with all sternness, Poe wondered why he was exposing his sword without warning. He was clearly surprised at the question, so he hesitated, but afterwards he calmly leaned over to her and told her that perhaps he would reflect on his behavior after he had killed everyone on this deck. The girl was truly shocked and wondered if he had lost his mind, and afterward wondered if he was the kind of man who would kill even his own soldiers if something went wrong. But now the protagonist couldn't back down, so she approached him to explain the situation, but suddenly a voice came from the loudspeakers, who said that Plan A was too complicated, so everyone should go to their Plan B. Then he said that all passengers on the ship should wear masks. At this point, gas was released throughout the ship. Demetrius immediately noticed it and realized it was soporific gas, and the protagonist was horrified and said that it was completely abnormal to conduct weddings this way. But before she knew it, she saw Demetrius running away, looking for a way out. She was outraged at the man's behavior and ended up running after him. The girl was horrified to find that the dress she was wearing was totally unsuitable for running. In the end, which was expected after a while, she did get tangled up in her dress and fell to the floor. She was very embarrassed about it, and so she hoped that no one saw her failure. But still, it did not go unnoticed by the young man, who turned on her and came closer. And the next moment he had picked her up in his arms like a log and thrown her on his shoulder and was running on. In the end, when they stopped, they saw a huge magic circle in front of them, which was blocking the exit. When the protagonist was looking at it, she thought that this magic sign, as well as everything that is arranged on this ship, looks like you can lock even a dragon in here. At which time the man had already started coughing because he had inhaled too much sleeping gas. The protagonist began to scrutinize the sign and realized that the symbols on the door are exactly the same as on the magic mechanism that is in the magic tower. But on the ship, and specifically in this passage, was not enough space to destroy it with a sword while not catching them themselves. She was already on her knees, but she was still conscious, and then the main character started coughing loudly and realized she was choking. Demetrius also kept up with the girl and knelt down, still holding onto the wall with one hand, and found himself opposite the protagonist, and gave her a serious and insanely displeased look, telling her that it was such a foolish thing to marry a woman like her. But the girl was insanely indignant at such a thing, and wondered if, in Demetrius's opinion, she was the person who wanted it. But the protagonist's eyes began to blur, and she realized she was probably starting to lose consciousness again. She absolutely did not understand what her parents were thinking, putting them to sleep, because in this case, the bride and groom will be in a complete blackout. The main character tried to keep herself awake, realizing that he cannot sleep, as something bad is bound to happen if she passes out. The next moment, she shifted her gaze to the man who was adjusting his collar to allow himself a better airflow. She was embarrassed to find that the young man was actually beginning to look insanely attractive, and wondered if she shouldn't have looked at him and wished she could capture his image, as his beauty was such that she would want to admire him afterwards. And Demetrius and Marsidia passed out at the same time and lay across from each other. Everything around them went dark. But the next moment, the protagonist felt some unknown sound of wind, which was not typical for the ship. When she opened her eyes, she realized that this was the second time she woke up in such a stupid way after falling asleep. But to her great surprise, she found the starry night sky in front of her, so she jumped up sharply in C's seat and started looking around her. Then she realized that she was in a rescue boat. Then she thought that although she was in a boat, she was not seasick, and therefore she was on the shore. As she looked at the space around her, she realized that she must be in the Empire, but she didn't see any of the guards. Then she realized that if this was the shore of the continent, but it didn't have one of the guards on it, it was most likely an island. She was very angry, but she put it on, thinking that the man she had married had some manners. Then she began to reason that it was still daylight when she passed out, so it had taken a certain amount of time to get here. Then her gaze fixed on the supplies that had been kindly left for them. There were several boxes, as well as chests. The protagonist unhappily moved away from the items, realizing that they were probably supplies they had left behind for survival. And then she began to look around, realizing that it was too quiet. So apparently, she was here alone. Then rising from her seat, she looked around in front of her. She found that in front of her now there was only a forest, with which it was very dark. And because of this, the protagonist was insanely scared to go there. But suddenly, she realized sharply that there must be at least something in those chests and boxes she'd found that she could use right now. But as soon as she opened one of the chests, she found a sealed envelope with a letter in it, and without thinking long, unfolded it. When I started reading it, it said that her parents had prepared a deserted honeymoon spot for them, and that as soon as they got the good news, they would immediately come to the place where they were to take them back, and said it was a summer house on the very edge of the map. The protagonist started laughing, but not because she was having fun. It was because the whole situation that had happened to her was crazy, and she thought that her parents were completely insane. And then I realized that they want her to get pregnant on the honeymoon. When you realized it, you were just horrified and called your parents crazy. But the friend suddenly heard the voice of Demetrius, who said that he had no idea that the girl had such a sharp tongue. Marsidia abruptly calmed down and turned around, immediately seeing Demetrius in front of her, who reported that the girl felt quite comfortable with the situation. She threw a cloth over herself to keep warm and said that Demetrius should not care about her rude speech, as she could speak as she wished, because there was no one else in this place but the two of them. The girl was madly displeased that the maid had put high heels on her, and did not understand why they had done so. But Mercedia was a mad fashionista, so she realized that wearing simple shoes under such a dress was also unforgivable. But suddenly, unexpectedly, a young man held out his hand to her, offering his help to get away. The girl scrutinized him carefully, after which she cautiously inquired if the man wanted her to take his hand. The man remained silent for a while, not knowing how to react. But then he smiled strangely, saying that the girl had some semblance of self-esteem after all. Then he turned around and started to leave. The protagonist was insanely indignant at such behavior on the part of the young man, and asked, did he think that she had no self-esteem? But he calmly said that he hoped that the girl understood in what position she found herself in, and afterward he gave her a cold and murderous look, informing her that it would not be at all difficult to break her frail neck with his bare hands. The protagonist was very displeased and inquired if he dared to threaten her, and he looked at her calmly and said that his words directly contained a threat. So it is not surprising. All this time Demetrius addressed Mercedia, calling her simply a woman. But the one looked at him and informed him that she had a name and introduced herself, whereupon she grudgingly said that she was neither a cow nor a pig nor any other animal. Therefore he should not call her in that manner, and said that the man must surely know her name. And before she introduced herself, but finding his aloof look in horror, realized that such a jerk as he really does not know her. So awkwardly asked again, does he not read the news in aristocratic society, or does not use magic messenger? He simply remained silent, and then the protagonist realized that most likely this man does not even have friends. But suddenly, he spoke sharply and said that they should end the conversation, and asked what the girl's intentions were for their wedding. She was horrified that he suspected her, and asked him if he thought someone like her was going to marry him. The girl continued to resent the fact that she had been kidnapped and was enraged by it, and if she had planned it, she would not have put herself on the boat after she had sedated herself with gas. So she had no such intentions at all, and if she had planned it, she would not have put herself in the boat after she had gassed herself. He, still covered in sand, wondered if the girl had absolutely no plans to marry him. She was shaking with rage that Demetrius had suggested such a thing, so she informed him that she didn't look happy at all, nor did she look like someone who enjoyed deceiving others. After which she looked at the brooding man in front of her, and didn't understand what was going through that man's mind right now. And maybe he really was ready to kill her right now on the spot. But to her surprise, he just calmly turned around and informed her that it was completely unimportant now. The girl was so shocked and immediately realized why the young man was nicknamed an idiot. But suddenly, interrupting her frenzy, Demetrius turned to her and told her that if Mercedia had not planned it all, they should go, as she obviously did not want to spend the whole night here. The girl was madly displeased, but she took off her shoes and followed him. He gave her an attentive look, then activated his communicator, and then a message appeared saying that there was absolutely no network here. The protagonist was displeased and wondered if all they had was the supplies they'd left on the boat. And they didn't even have any servants with them, so apparently the people who were lured in by all this don't even realize they're going to try to escape. But the man calmly informed them that it's insanely hard to escape, so apparently they're counting on Mercedia and Demetrius to make them happy before they run out of supplies, and apparently they're mistaking them for some kind of rabbits. The heroine didn't understand the results at first, but afterwards she remembered that her parents were planning to get her pregnant on their honeymoon, but in the end, she just thought that her parents had completely lost their minds. The next moment, Demetrius grabbed some sacks on his back and motioned for the girl to follow him, as he could not get her to work like that. She followed him obediently, thinking that she would have made a fuss if the man had made her carry the luggage with him, for she was not at all fitted for such work. In the end, a picture of the house did not open in front of him, and the protagonist thought happily that at last she would have a comfortable bed in front of her, as well as the bathroom she'd been longing for, as well as magical artifacts for cleaning. But when she opened the door, she was horrified to see that the house was insanely neglected, and everything looked like someone hadn't lived here in a very long time, and then screamed indignantly that someone dared to leave her in such conditions. Demetrius, listening to her perpetual grumbling, was tired of the constant noise, but still said nothing. The protagonist thought that the Empire started to develop various magical artifacts after surviving 2 large-scale wars, and now all people can't live without them. The magical artifacts were quite different for building houses, and also for lighting, and there were even magical artifacts that were used to break toilets and latrines. The people of the Empire had adapted to their use and called themselves a civilized society, and they could no longer imagine their lives without such things. And Marcedia Sasha was the only daughter of Duke Isaac Sasha, the chief sage of the magical tower, so was at the heart of the magical civilization. But now she was stuck on the island, cut off from all civilization and feeling insanely uncomfortable and gross about it, especially since she was stuck with a man as ignorant as Demetrius. Finally, he walked past her and wondered, is the girl really going to stand in one place and interfere with his work? But she's not happy, asked, does the man think she should step on a wooden floor when she doesn't even know where it came from or what it's made of? To which the man said that the girl could just walk in wearing the same shoes that she had just thrown away, but Ta grudgingly wailed that she could not wear the same shoes inside and outside, whereupon they grudgingly realized that she seemed to have no choice at all, and was left sitting there thinking about what she should do. In the end, a young man just walked past her, and the protagonist was outraged that he saw her standing there barefoot and just walked past her. She was outraged that she had to spend time with such an arrogant young man. She looked at him unhappily and wondered if he was going to leave so easily, and then she thought that she should definitely keep everything under control. So she turned to him unhappily and wondered if he was just going to leave her here too. But he started to run, and Marcedia was shocked at how fast this young man could run, and she doubted that he was an ordinary man with such physical abilities. But after grudgingly looking around the house and realizing that she had no other choice, and thinking that this was really very outrageous, because normally her maids would have already lined up to greet her. Also, she would have received a high-class treatment for her skin by professionals and changed into a nightgown prepared by her personal maid. She smiled and realized that all the maids must have cooperated with the wedding organizers, and that must be why they were all there. She started to plan her revenge against those maids, but finally, she went to look around the house. The protagonist realized that although it was dirty and old, the interior was not that bad. In the end, after 30 minutes of walking around the house from head to toe, she felt sufficiently fatigued because she had not moved so much on the stairs before, and thought about the fact that the paintings and sculptures are quite authentic. It would be nice if she could study them and touch them in the future. But it was the interior of the house that seemed the strangest to her. The girl was shocked, but admired the man's strength enough to think that he really was a monster. And when she turned around, she saw a tired, out-of-breath Demetrius, who had carried all the heavy luggage at once. Then Demetrius began to warm up in order to prevent his muscles from swelling after such a strain. And the protagonist noticed that his body looked quite amazing. And if she had posted it on the magical Instagram or Facebook, the pictures would have gathered a huge number of views and admiring messages and comments. But afterwards, she thought that such a picture she would save on her personal artifacts and use periodically as a treat for the eyes. The man, seeing her attentive gaze, fixed his hair and asked, "Has she been sitting here all this time doing nothing?" The girl was clearly unhappy with such a comment and thought that he should have just shut up and not talked to her at all, but then replied that she was not idle at all, but was looking around the house. To A's surprise, Demetrius inquired if she had found something she could use as a weapon, and also inquired about the home's defense system and if it had secret passageways. She laughed embarrassedly and wondered if the man was going to war. Then she called him some kind of savage and laughed. At this point, Demetrius couldn't stand it and was really unhappy with this reaction. So he reported that the girl was stuck alone on a desert island with this savage. But the man only turned away from her, disgruntled to leave, and inquired whether she thought he would ever want to marry someone like her. After which she said, more calmly, that it was obvious that they had been abandoned. Here means the wedding had already taken place. The Demetrius, already less disgruntled, turned to her and examined her from head to toe before tossing her the sack. The protagonist was quite surprised, but afterwards she opened it and found a pink shoe there. Demetrius then calmly explained that it seems before that the girl had been yelling about not being able to move around without her house shoes. But she was not happy about this from Demetrius and asked him if he thought she could wear pink shoes under a white dress. He was madly indignant at the girl's comment that such shoes were not in fashion now and was very angry, not understanding how he could tolerate this girl for a long time. When they had already settled down a bit, the protagonist turned to Demetrius and said that this house had been built with an improved open interior structure, and she didn't understand from what era the builders had managed to dig up such a trend. He looked at her carefully and wondered if this trend had already become obsolete. Then the girl calmly explained that it looked like it had been built about 3 years ago, but he calmly refuted her again, over his head, informed her that this house had been built less than 6 months ago, and inquired if there was anything here to match the modern style, to which the protagonist calmly explained that there was absolutely nothing here. And that was very strange, because if someone buys a deserted island and builds a house of this size, they would never use designs from 3 years ago. Then she said that maybe the people who had closed them in had other reasons besides their forced marriage and childbirth. Demetrius calmly exhaled and explained that given how vulnerable the mansion's defensive structure was, he didn't think it would be wise. But in any case, they had been kidnapped and locked up here after all. The next moment he abruptly went upwards. The protagonist was madly surprised, so she went after him. But when they got near the room, they heard some scent, and the girl thought that perhaps it was again the scent of soporific gas. But when the door opened abruptly, she realized it wasn't the soporific gas at all, but the scent of roses scattered on their heart-shaped bed. Demetrius and Marcedia stood there in shock, realizing that it seemed nothing could surprise them at all from now on. The next moment, Demetrius slammed the door unhappily, rather sharply, and then ran downstairs. The girl looked at him and asked him to wait. Then she asked him where his clothes were. Then she was not satisfied to be told that if he could find her pink slippers, there must be other clothes nearby. But the next moment the man, tired of her perpetual screaming, grabbed her arm, whereupon he informed her that the girl had chosen a pretty good position and apparently thought that he would let her live just because he couldn't kill her now. But the protagonist smiled and looked at their crossed fingers and wondered if that meant that Demetrius was actually keeping her alive just because he wanted to hold her hand. But the man was clearly unhappy with this reaction and looked at her nervously. Immediately unhooked their hands and then began to shake off his hand. And the protagonist stood behind his back, watching all this, and began to get angry and asked how he dared to shake off his hand after he held her hand. But with a disgruntled look at her, the Demetrius informed her that he really didn't understand why he had left her alive all this time. But the protagonist calmly looked at him and told him that her death would be the greatest loss to the world. But he calmly wondered if the war could end with her beauty. But the girl calmly fixed her hair and informed her that no one knows how it will be, but most likely the war will bow to its knees just by seeing her. The protagonist was outraged by this behavior, so she grabbed the man by the face with both hands and turned his head to herself and asked if there was anyone more beautiful than her among the people he'd ever seen. And he looked at her incredulously and then told her that there was such a person. The protagonist started shaking him and resenting him, asking who it was and where he met a woman who was prettier than her and how much prettier she was, but calmly explained that women like Marcedia were not to his taste at all. The latter, hearing such displeasure, said that it must be very unlucky for a man who was to his taste, and inquired how that woman who was more beautiful than she was looked like. Then he described that she was a small, slender, elegant, reserved, and modest woman, with short snow-white hair and shining eyes. The protagonist only grudgingly remarked that his words sounded exactly like a description of a woman from the 10th century, and wondered if he wanted to go back in time to meet her. But the man calmly and mockingly informed him that a woman like Marcedia could never be like the woman he liked, and even if she were reborn. And Marcedia would have been outraged by such comments from a man, and then grudgingly asked if he was a pedophile. Then calmly explained that his look around while he was talking about his ideal type, especially when I said small confirms it. And if the girl is so small, it means it's still a child. But he indignantly said that he had seen this girl when he was quite young, and afterward, he thought puzzledly of the fact that he was having this conversation without realizing it himself. So some time passed, and finally the young men chose the rooms of their preference. Demetrius chose the room opposite the staircase, and Marcedia next to the bathroom. Somehow they both had several reasons why they chose these rooms. But the main reason was that they never wanted to sleep next to each other. Finally, lying on the bed, the protagonist thought about the fact that everything was going well until she got hungry, because she still hadn't eaten since she got here, and all she had time to eat was a cup of herbal medicinal drink when she was still on the ship. So in this state, even a walk on the beach feels like hard work. But the protagonist was surprised that her stomach was still not rumbling, although afterward thought that her stomach cannot rumble, as this cannot happen to Mercedes Sachet herself, and then remarked that if that sound was coming from her stomach, it would sound kind of cute. Then she rose from her seat and looked at herself in the mirror and found that she looked fine, so she felt much better and decided to go to the man's room to offer him something to eat. When she was near him, she wondered how she should address him and whether she should call him by his name. She turned away from the door, shocked, and then screamed at Demetrius, wondering what he was doing and why he was trying to kill her. The girl was clearly outraged and asked why he thought it was a normal reaction to hear noises outside his door, but he should explain himself. And he should have explained himself. But he calmly explained that it was a normal reaction if there was an assassin or another enemy at the door. Mercedes was outraged and thought that the man in front of her was probably crazy, and wondered where his brain was when he thought that there might be someone else on the deserted island besides them. But he calmly informed her that from the sound of the footsteps he supposed it might be her, but that he had done so anyway. And then, not letting her continue to be indignant, he asked her why she had come. The girl looked up at him and wondered if he'd had dinner before, after which she wondered if that wasn't at all what she'd originally meant to say, since she'd never even set foot in the kitchen and thought he might have cooked something. But afterwards, not understanding why she came to him at all, she shouted that she didn't care at all whether he starved to death or not, so he should take care of himself. The man grudgingly informed her that she was being dramatic, so the main character put on an apron and a special outfit for cooking and went to the kitchen and thought that there are still a lot of ways in the world that can make her Mercedes Sasha even more perfect. This meant one thing. The main character knew absolutely nothing about cooking. Then she said that it would be easy to cook something because she would just light a fire and the dish would somehow cook itself. Finally, putting the pan on the stove, she remembered that cooking shows were insanely popular on Magical YouTube. So she had been watching them a lot lately and was confident that she could make at least some soup, since she'd watched the show so many times. Eventually, she started doing everything according to the recipe, and remembered that the recipe seemed to say that after frying the ingredients in oil, you should pour in some water and boil it. She started pouring everything in and praised herself for being the smartest and best planner, as expected. But when she added the water, it started to fizzle and exploded. At this moment, Demetrius at the last moment managed to draw the girl away from the scene of the explosion, and frightenedly enclosed her in his arms and pulled her away from the frying pan, which almost hurt her. He called the girl crazy, and she in turn felt rather awkward and embarrassed in his arms and didn't know how to behave. And then she shifted her gaze to the man, who inquired, was she trying to kill herself in such a ridiculous way? But she was shocked enough at such an assumption to inform him that Demetrius had wanted to kill her yesterday anyway, so he should be so concerned. He sighed unhappily, after which looked in her face and informed her that he himself was wondering why he was so concerned about her. After which let go and asked the girl to stand where she was standing and not move from her spot, calling her a kitchen pest. Eventually, after a while, Demetrius cooked an insanely delicious seafood dish. Seeing all this, the girl asked him, does she have to eat absolutely all of this for dinner? The one putting shrimp into her plate, wondering why she was asking and explaining that the ingredients would just go bad, so they wouldn't have anything to eat in case that happened. And then he asked what she was thinking when she was making a mess in the kitchen, because she just spoiled the food, and then said that if the girl after all this dinner is still not full, she can catch a lizard and cook it the way she wants. The protagonist was madly indignant at such a statement from Demetrius and called him a barbarian. But Demetrius calmly called the girl in response to the kitchen pests, after which he set her up with some delicious smoky grilled shrimp and wondered why she was looking at this food like that, and maybe he had cooked something she couldn't eat. She awkwardly informed me that it wasn't that at all, and then asked me how to eat it, referring to the shrimp. The man was madly surprised at this, but sat down and peeled a shrimp for her, telling her that not being able to peel shrimp is truly pathetic, and even if he hadn't killed her himself, she would have died in 3 days. The protagonist was madly happy that he had agreed to help her, at which time he handed her a shrimp to pass into her hands, but she ate it right out of his hands and thanked him. While the girl was chewing the shrimp, Demetrius was indignant and asked what she wanted by such behavior, But Marsidia looked at him unhappily and asked why Demetrius cared what she was doing, because earlier he had told her that he was not interested in her because she was not his type. The next moment, he moved closer to her to remove what she had plastered on her face, and informed her that even if the girl wasn't his type, it didn't mean he wouldn't do anything to her. She smiled slyly at him, and afterward I ran my finger across his chest and said that was an insanely scary statement. Demetrius was embarrassed by this and was about to say something to the girl, but he couldn't find the right words. The best option was to keep peeling the shrimp. And finally, he said that the main character was just a crazy woman, but then she seemed completely unoffended by something like that, so happy that Demetrius agreed to peel the rest of the shrimp for her. In the end, she ate it all, and when she went to her room, she was happy that she had eaten well, although she was worried that she might have eaten too much, but that was the least of her worries. When she found herself in her room, she found that life without at least one of the servants was too difficult for her, as she had to change into her many dresses and nightgowns and close the curtains herself. But suddenly, she found very dark clouds outside the window, which were out of character, and she wondered that not long ago there had been stars here. Whereupon she reflected that such weather was unreasonably depressing, but eventually decided to go to bed, thinking that she needed to get out of this island as soon as possible. But first, she needed some sleep, so she should think about that later. In the end, it rained heavily, and the protagonist woke up to the water rushing down on her. Then she was frightened to find that her ceiling was gone, and so she immediately ran to the other rooms to find the ceiling. After getting out of the room, she realized that she needed to head to the first floor, for there must be a place to hide. But then she noticed to her horror that the wall had suddenly decided to fall, and so their house served as a great place to get a good soaking. She looked at him carefully and wondered if they had raincoats or umbrellas, but he sensibly enough pointed out that they probably didn't have any in this place. The protagonist was horrified to notice that even the bathroom ceiling had been blown off, and Demetrius remarked indignantly that such a place was absolutely unfit for living. Eventually, they went in search of a dry place, and the protagonist grudgingly remarked that apparently there was only one room left that they hadn't entered yet, but he said he didn't want to go in there at all. Then the protagonist grabbed him by the hair and grudgingly informed him that she couldn't get wet because of some rain. But Demetrius calmly explained that not long ago she had tried to die by fire, then informed him that such rain was absolutely usual for soldiers. But the protagonist restlessly informed that she was not a soldier at all, but a noble lady, and with a more serious calm face, she explained that she was a fragile girl and her clothes were too thin. But afterwards, she realized that she had made a huge mistake, as there was no need to draw his attention to her clothes in such a situation. After all, she had completely covered his body and looked quite indecent. And then looking at her from head to toe, Demetrius at once began to take off his military uniform. And Marsidia, looking at him, thought what she would have to do if this man really tried to do something indecent to her. The next moment he came closer to her, and the protagonist looked at him carefully, not understanding what she should do, but knew that it was worth at least trying to escape in this case. And afterward, she shrank hard and thought about the fact that she had never met a man so handsome before. But despite that, all the rumors about him were just awful. So she couldn't know about his preferences, and maybe they were strange enough. But she tried to convince herself that such a handsome man with such an attractive body couldn't be bad. But the next moment he just calmly put the cape over her. The protagonist felt quite embarrassed by the realization that he wasn't going to do anything bad to her. The next moment he calmly told the girl to follow him and called her a doggy. She blushed even more and did not understand why she was reacting to him like that. When they passed the room, they saw that the bed was protected by a magical barrier and was completely dry. Then Demetrius said, disgruntled, that the water barrier only extended over the bed, and it seemed absurd enough. And Marsidia added unhappily that she couldn't even believe it. And apparently, those who had planned it all had no limit to their cunning. Then she realized that the storm must have been created by meteorological magic as well. If so, only one man in the empire could have done such a thing, the great sage Isaac Sasha, her father. Then remembering her father, the protagonist hoped that he was stuck on another confusing error in a new theory. And then she thought that she hated her father for such antics. And Demetrius thought that as soon as he got out of this place, he would deal with the mastermind of it all. As a result, the protagonist and Demetrius ended up on the same bed. But they sat on opposite sides, and the girl thought that if you look carefully at all the furniture, it looks quite high quality. And it's funny enough that in the mansion, as if the canopies, curtains, or something else, everything is made of the best materials. Demetrius suddenly threw something on the floor, which frightened the girl very much. She indignantly looked at the broken vase and said that he had frightened her very much and wondered why he had done it. But the man calmly explained that he needed to see if the barrier had locked them inside. But the protagonist looked at him unhappily and informed him that the man had no idea how much is a vase worth. But the guy just gave her a disgruntled look and told Da to stop making a big deal out of it. He took a rose that was lying on the couch and asked if he could throw it away, but without waiting for an answer, he threw it away. In the end, she managed to fly through and hit the closet, and the protagonist unhappily hit him with a pillow and told him that he should not so test this barrier and so treat the things that were here. But men reasoned that not only inanimate objects can penetrate barriers. In the end, the protagonist indignantly continued to beat him with a pillow and said that these were her favorite flowers, and the vase was also her favorite. He tried to say something to her, but the protagonist wouldn't even listen to him, continuing to beat him and saying that the man had absolutely no sense of beauty. The next moment, the protagonist again swung because of that to strike with a pillow and thought that she was very angry at the man for the fact that he showed absolutely no interest in her because she was wearing only pajamas, especially wet through. She was angry. I do not understand how he cannot be interested because it is possible only if he was not a man. But at this point, Demetrius informed her that the girl should just calm down and listen to him, but she had absolutely no intention of doing so he had to grab her arms to stop her from throwing another pillow punch. She ended up on top of him, sitting just below his stomach, and their faces were very close to each other. The main character blushed from embarrassment and from anger. And then she was preparing to strike another blow with a pillow and wondered how the man dared to use physical force against her. But the man embarrassingly ordered her to get off him as soon as possible. At this point, the protagonist froze, and the man reported that apparently the girl had not paid any attention at all to where she was now sitting. When she looked down at the bottom, I think she started to realize what had happened. And the man was very embarrassed and informed her that she was sitting where she shouldn't be, and especially in such a revealing way. But the protagonist seemed happy about it. She was also pleased at the embarrassment on Demetrius's part. But the next moment, the man rose sharply, and he ended up on top of the girl and was panting heavily. She was madly surprised to see him and his embarrassed face. The protagonist said that if he was going to do something, he should first release her wrist, as it hurt a little. At that moment, Demetrius realized with embarrassment just what kind of position they were in. And then he jumped to his feet and informed her that the girl shouldn't even hope that they would ever go any further than this. Demetrius was outraged by this reaction and said that the guy looked as if he had just hugged a brown bear. He was outraged by this comparison and asked the girl to get dressed as soon as possible or to cover herself with a blanket after all. She calmly said that there were absolutely no clothes for her to change into, and then said that the man had been behaving strangely lately. But Demetrius nervously explained that he had recently given her his cloak and she could use it. Ta calmly inquired, "Does man really want her lying in bed in wet clothes?" But then he simply said that he was not bothered at all and asked her to hide her ugly body from him. She was literally shocked by something like that, and how dare he call her body ugly. So she approached him and sat down closer to him and told him to look at her carefully and asked who else he could see such a perfect body from, but he embarrassedly waved the girl away and ordered her not to point her body in such clothes in his face. It didn't last long and ended with Demetrius quietly wrapping her in a blanket so that she couldn't move, and then he looked warily somewhere in the distance. But he calmly explained that they seemed to be under attack. But suddenly, Mado's mirror appeared in front of them. The protagonist untangled herself from the blanket, taking advantage of Demetrius's surprise to inform him that this mirror had been remotely activated by a magical artifact of the imperial palace. The Mado mirror was used when something important happened in the country, and the whole empire gets a message projected in the air. To use it, you have to spend a lot of money and magical energy, so it's really just a show to show off your wealth. The man looked at him and wondered, had they been declared war again, and what was the reason for sending him even here? But suddenly, they turned on the news, and there a happy anchorwoman announced that there was news from the imperial palace. The daughter of the Duke Sasha Marcella and Admiral Demetrius have married, and now they will show footage from the scene of the event. As a result, the majestic ship appeared on the screen at first, but it was absolutely not the ship on which the protagonist and Demetrius woke up. Next came a shot of the main character being painted while she was still asleep. Marcedia resented the fact that apparently that was the reason she was left unconscious. In the end, the presenter announced that further there will be footage of the ceremony. Hearing this, Demetrius was literally furious at such a statement, not understanding what he now sees in front of him. And the protagonist unhappily noted that apparently they did not manage to make a close-up with him because of his perpetually dissatisfied facial expression. In the end, a shot of the protagonist and Demetrius standing from the back and making a vow that from this day forward they would belong to each other appeared on the Mado mirror in front of them. The protagonist was insanely indignant that they used such a staging and told Demetrius that he should take a closer look at how bad magic they had conjured up. Eventually, the next shot was of the guests clapping happily and being madly delighted with their betrothal. Finally, the priest said that from this moment on, the couple should, whatever happen, to love and cherish each other and respect the ancestors and duties of husband and wife and be together forever in life and beyond. Whereupon he solemnly declared that in the name of God and His Majesty, he solemnly swore to defend this marriage at all costs. It was followed by a kiss of the main character with Demetrius. The presenter admired how beautiful their wedding was, then reported that after the romantic wedding ceremony on the ship, Demetrius and Mercedes said that they will immediately go on a honeymoon trip. And as far as they know, they are on a beautiful South Island. The protagonist excitedly shook Demetrius by the sleeve and informed him that the horrible thing was that they had conjured up images that looked completely worse than they really were. So even though they used magic, they didn't look like their real selves at all. So no one's going to believe it. But suddenly she froze at the realization that apparently everyone actually believed it. Then she let go of his sleeve and informed him that the wedding papers had already been signed. Demetrius immediately realized what she was referring to, so he informed her that it would be obvious since they had sent the video here using Mad's mirror. Then Marcedia excitedly thought about the fact that if the wedding was approved by the royal family, then to get a divorce would again need their permission, which would be very difficult to get. Then disgruntledly thought about the fact that all the people of the empire must have already seen this wedding from behind the mirror. Demetrius was very displeased and realized that everything that had happened was probably that bastard's fault. And the protagonist, looking at his face, wondered if he meant the present prince, and then smiled good-naturedly, and sadly informed her that if Demetrius had made it back to his country in time, he wouldn't have had to marry her. But he didn't respond to that, and when he looked all around, as well as at the heavy downpour, he realized that it seemed they would have to sleep here. And Marcedia, with a sort of strange smile, asked if Demetrius should go and sleep elsewhere. Then she said with a bored look that he might do something strange, pretending it was one of his sleeping habits, or he might confuse her with someone else, or he might talk in his sleep, or he might jump on her in the middle of the night, as he had just recently. Dima had literally nothing to say, so he awkwardly asked, "Does the girl want him to hug her or something?" But then she calmly inquired, "Is there anything he cannot do? After all, he is now her husband." Speaking of this, the protagonist behaved quite calmly, but Demetrius covered his face with his hands and cursed quietly. But this did not go unnoticed by the protagonist, so she angrily approached him and wondered if he had just decided to lash out about it. Then wondered if he thought he was the only one who was really annoyed by the situation, and then almost crying said that she hates the fact that she had to marry someone like him, and she is not going to sleep with him, and as soon as they get back, she is going to file for divorce, since this wedding was illegal in the first place. So she will sue as soon as she gets off this island. Demetrius was rather puzzled by such behavior on the part of the girl, as well as her abruptness. In the end, while he was stunned by her reaction, the girl quickly built a barricade of pillows and threateningly told him not to cross the line. But he sensibly noticed that the girl had made her side wider, so he wanted to move the pillows to make 2 equal parts, but she shouted that he should not cross the line in any way. He was outraged at the girl's behavior, so he snatched the blanket and said that he would accept all the terms, but in return, he would take what he could cover himself with. The protagonist was outraged by his behavior, but she forced herself to calm down and exhaled. And then she thought about the fact that she had never even thought about getting married in her whole life, and now she could not imagine that such an unpleasant situation would ever happen, and all the while Demetrius was awake. And so he thought that no matter how beautiful the girl was, her pompousness and her craziness is what he can't stand about women. But as soon as he saw her sobbing quietly, he realized that they were alike in some way. Then he sharply recalled his childhood memories, when he found a little girl and asked her why she was crying. But to his surprise, she told him that no one loved her and no one wanted her. Then he looked at her earnestly and informed her that, if that was indeed the case, he would love her and only her forever from then on. The crying girl looked at him excitedly, not understanding why he would say something like that. Thinking back on this situation, Demetrius realized that he and his lover were supposed to get married when they grew up, but in the end, the wedding never happened. But the next moment I was brought out of my musings by a spinning girl in the bed who was shivering. The man looked at her worriedly and realized that she was probably cold, as the girl looked insanely fragile right now. So he gently adjusted her blanket and then thought that maybe because he had spent too much time with such a crazy girl, he was starting to do strange things. But eventually, Demetrius calmed down, giving Mercedes both blankets and just lay there, watching from the sidelines. But suddenly, he abruptly felt someone's presence and thought that they were being attacked. Then he stood up abruptly, realizing that most likely their opponent was not dangerous as he was acting too recklessly, so he would be able to overpower him quickly. But the next moment, I realized that it was just a girl who had risen abruptly from her seat. The man was quite surprised at this, as he had previously thought that the girl was asleep, and began to look closely at her face to see if she was crying now, but she acted calm enough. Then Demetrius wondered why he even bothered with her, since there was still the possibility that this woman was a spy, or an assassin disguised as Mercedes. So one had to be careful. But eventually, the girl pulled a device out of nowhere. And at that moment, the man thought that perhaps the girl was a spy trying to find another way to contact the outside world. Eventually, the protagonist, half asleep, started browsing the feed and found that not the magical Facebook, not the magical Twitter, not even the magical Instagram, nor even the magical Messenger was working. And she had absolutely no idea how she was supposed to entertain herself, since she couldn't even upload the photos she wanted. Demetrius was really shocked to see that even in this situation, all the girl thought about was how to amuse herself. Eventually, she woke up, and she mourning, and sleepily looked around her place to find that she was all alone on her bed. And then she looked around unhappily, wondering where Demetrius had gotten to. But she ended up fixing her hair and was shocked to find that it was completely damaged and broken. She immediately remembered how she had taken meticulous care of her hair earlier, and how everyone had complimented her on it. Because she had used all the magic and care available to her, and had managed to grow it that long without damaging a single strand. Then she realized that she got wet in the rain and went to bed without even drying her hair, and she was probably crazy to do that. And then she realized that at that very second, her hair was screaming for help, and she had to get it back before it was all gone. So she rushed briskly to her room, realizing that even if the maids had betrayed her, they couldn't have forgotten to put in her makeup. But suddenly, she was excited to find Demetrius, who was literally destroying their house. He calmly explained that he was not destroying the house into pieces, just looking for magical artifacts. The protagonist noticed that she did not even have time to say anything to him. But anyway, she moved closer to the wall and looked at the microchips. She wondered if he had torn this wall apart just to see what was behind it. But Demetrius calmly explained that Mercedes should go about her business. But after rubbing his neck awkwardly, asked what was the reason for Mercedes coming down so early, for she could have slept a little longer. The protagonist only looked at her unhappily and wondered, is this really what a groom should say to his bride, after their first night together? Dimitri got sick from such a remark, and told the girl that she was talking nonsense, but she shouted at him and asked him where he was going to go again, and whether he wanted to break something else. But he turned around and shouted that he wasn't breaking anything, but was going to start checking the mansion, and asked if the girl had any objections. She nervously explained that she wanted to take a bath right now, so he shouldn't bother her. But he indignantly remarked that he didn't care and wasn't even going to look in that direction, so they parted ways. Eventually, the girl was about to go, as suddenly the guy on the spot turned towards the protagonist, informed her that if something happens, she should call him. She was a little embarrassed, but afterward, she thought she hadn't meant to call him out at all. But some time passed, and the protagonist got excited and called Demetrius, who ran into her room thinking that something terrible had happened to her. ended up catching a crying girl looking in the mirror, who was sobbing because she couldn't handle her hair on her own. The heroine was indignant at such an attitude towards her hair, which she had grown for so long, so she scolded him. But Demetrius tired the message that if she was in the apartment headquarters, she would have been locked up somewhere by now. But the protagonist kept yelling about how Demetrius just doesn't realize how much her hair means to her. He was just indignant and said that of course he couldn't possibly know that. So if a girl can't handle them herself, she should just cut them off. She gave him a cold look and told him to stop acting like that. And he himself offered to help her in case of trouble. He admitted her rightness after all, therefore, and cursing, inquired how he could help her. She looked at him in surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. Then he shyly took his hand away from her face and asked how he could help the girl with her hair. Eventually came a long time later, and Demetrius was clearly unhappy with his hair, and the protagonist was only dispensing advice about what he was doing wrong or how he should handle her hair. She looked very unhappy and told the man that he was really inept at doing hair. But he grudgingly informed her that the girl should shut up before he ripped out the hair. At this point, Demetrius froze in place. I don't understand why he should feel so humiliated doing this lady's hair all this time. But in the end, he ordered himself to endure because the main character really looked like she would die if he didn't help her now. And then he said that the girl was insanely picky when it came to her hair, so I can see why a few words escaped her. Eventually, the protagonist embarrassedly announced that Demetrius was too close, so she could feel her warmth, and then suddenly she let out an exhalation that was more like a moan. And then she looked at him very embarrassed and told him that it was completely accidental and it was unknowingly. But he just threw her head back and hovered over her and told her to stop acting like that. The protagonist was still embarrassed, but agreed to his words. And it was a while before Demetrius was incredibly proud to announce that he'd finished her hair. The protagonist, looking around herself in a small mirror, saw that the strands were sticking out and grudgingly reported that the man was really bad with his hands. That one was maddeningly unhappy with such a comment after all the work he'd done. But the protagonist smiled calmly and informed him that it wasn't that bad. So you shouldn't be so upset. The next moment Demetrius was about to turn around and leave. I'll tell you that next time about Marcidius, you shouldn't call him out on such nonsense. But there she asked him to stop, and then looked away embarrassed and blushed, thanking him for his help. Demetrius looked at her in surprise, not sure how to react to such a statement. But the next moment, the girl kicked him out of her bathroom, burning with embarrassment, and informed him that he should leave since she was going to take a bath. Finally, she went to the mirror that adjusted the settings of the bathtub and started looking at what modes the bathtub had, and was delighted that there was a customization option and you could even add essential oils or turn on the bubbles. In the end, she was just delighted with this kind of thing and lay quietly in her bathtub enjoying the fact that she can finally feel alive again and happy that the bath bombs smell wonderful and also have a beautiful view. The protagonist pretty much said that if she had a link, she would have been very keen to post a couple of pictures. She was a really social media addicted person. And then she thought that even if the rumors had betrayed her, they couldn't have stashed her communicator somewhere, so it would be strange if they hadn't stashed at least one somewhere. So she got up from her seat and headed out to find the thought that the girls were sure to leave at least once, realizing that they would never see each other again. She finally found it and was glad to see that it was still a little charged. So if she looked hard enough and could find a place in the house where she could charge it, she ended up taking a couple of photos of her contented after shower and captioned it as her beautifully relaxing morning and put some hashtags such as honeymoon, travel, and also newlywed diary. Then tried to post, but ended up frustrated admitting to myself that it was foolish to hope that any of this would load. But suddenly, a man burst into the room who did not explain his actions, picked up the girl on his arm, she was madly surprised, and so asked what he was doing and demanded to let her go. Eventually, they ended up in a warehouse or a restroom, and the man put her on the floor and told her that she should sit here and wait for him and not to leave the room. The main character was madly indignant at such words from Demetrius's side, so she wondered what it meant and how he could break into her bathtub and lock her in here. But he pinned her down with his hands on both sides, making the protagonist madly embarrassed. Then she stammered to remind him that she'd asked him to explain himself. But the next moment he clamped his hand over her mouth and looked intently into her face and asked her to be quiet. He took his hand off the girls after a while and explained that he no longer felt anyone's presence. And then looking around carefully, he explained that he'd found traces of mermaids near the mansion. The The protagonist remembers the mermaids asked, "Are they around, and whether the man is sure?" That carefully looked at him said that killed many of the mermaids being a captain in the Navy, so that can definitely say that it is exactly the mermaids, although it is absolutely not pleased him. The girl grabbed his shirt, looked at him admiringly, and began her proposal. But Tot immediately stopped and said that whatever she was thinking, he immediately refuses such a proposal. But the main character did not listen to him, and ignoring his warning said that she madly wants to see mermaids and also to make a couple of photos. Demetrius was clearly tired of the main character being so awful and explained to her that he had previously told her that this was not an amusement park or a resort, so it would be long past time for her to realize that. But that did not listen. I asked if she could look at them, at least from afar. Looking at the main character who talked about it with such enthusiasm, did not understand how he could find such a crazy woman. But Ta continued that she knew how to protect herself so she wouldn't get in his way. She looked at Demetrius, not understanding why he wasn't commenting on it and looking at her strangely. But the next moment there was a thump, which she managed to turn away from and was really shocked. And then she looked at him unhappily, still not sure why he was doing that. Then he stated that she did have a rather fast reaction time, so it would be better if she pumped up her stamina and advised her to go jogging on the beach once in a while. The protagonist was totally uninspired by his inspection and called him crazy. After which, Poe wondered how a husband could raise his fists at his wife to make sure she was self-defense. And they were not even a real couple. In the end, Demetrius realized that he couldn't get away from the girl and told her that she could do as she pleased. The main character was madly happy about it and said that she would take just a couple of photos and then post them in the social network. The man indignantly noticed that she could not do it, but suddenly noticed that she had a communicator on her hand and asked where she got it. But then he grudgingly said that it did not matter because there was no connection. The main character knew that mermaids are a race of magical creatures that live in the ocean and do not have a certain level of intelligence. Among them, there are also newts, creatures similar to humans, and even given their similarity to humans, they do not communicate with them. This is why they attract a lot of attention and are a popular topic for discussion among people. The main character thought about it and realized that recently there was a big exhibition where the newt was presented, so if she takes a few photos of a live newt, she will surely become famous. And Marcedia was a fan of attracting attention, so she abruptly dashed to her room to change and eventually go to take pictures. In the end, a little more time passed, and they were already walking through the forest, and Demetrius reasoned that he had not even noticed earlier that once they arrived here, then everything in this place seems quite strange. First of all, creatures living in the ocean under no circumstances do not go ashore without a reason. Also, he determined their location by constellations, and realized that the island is in the boundary of the sea protection, so that accordingly, it could not be a place where mermaids can appear. But they've left quite visible traces of their presence here, so either they're stupid or careless. But the reason could be something else entirely. It could be a warning from them. The protagonist followed him admiringly and looked at Demetrius and asked him if he was sure that mermaids were here. But he calmly explained that he did not understand how the girl had the courage to follow him here and asked if she wanted to die young. Peering into his face, the girl informed him that if the mermaids showed up while Demetrius was somewhere far away, it would become much more of a problem. He remained silent, realizing it was a sensible enough idea. But eventually, his attention was drawn to a tree broken in half, and then he abruptly stopped the girl who had hitherto been hurrying him in search of the mermaids, for she was very anxious to see them. He stopped her and asked her to get down, told her to stay where she was. He eventually moved on. After that, there were frightening screams, which frightened the main character, and she did not understand how to behave. And then there was silence, and Demetrius stepped closer to the protagonist and informed her that she could come out. Then Demetrius looked at her and said that if they had left, they would have had to go somewhere else. After which he pointed to the mermaid and informed her that this was exactly what she wanted to see. The main character was horrified and looked at the creature and said it was an insanely scary entity. Demetrius tried to calm her down and told her that the girls should be quieter as they didn't know how many of them were still around. But there she was still staring at the mermaid's face and saying how ugly the creature was. But Mermaid grudgingly remarked that the girl shouldn't have said it twice, since it was obvious the first time. Such comments of the girl were reacted to by Demetrius, who grudgingly asked the protagonist how she'd imagined mermaids before. but she calmly explained that in the great directory of evil creatures, mermaids looked more decent,